the Cutting Edge Stage at CogX 2021. I'm your MC, Jess Wade, a research fellow at Imperial College London. Please remember to share your thoughts and ideas on social media using the hashtag CogX2021. Many thanks to Accenture, BT, Visa, and Quantum Black for supporting CogX 2021, and to all of you for making it along to our hybrid festival. We have so far had some extraordinary speakers, presenters, and discussions on the Cutting Edge Stage, and the schedule for this afternoon looks even better. So, what's coming up? Next, we're going to discuss and explore the state of play in deep tech, and specifically where we think the next $100 billion deep tech company might come from. The pandemic has accelerated a whole host of new opportunities in deep tech, from life sciences to space exploration and quantum computing. This afternoon, we're joined by partners, investors, and future forecasters, Ian Hogarth and Kate Kallot, who'll be guided in their discussion by broadcaster and researcher Gemma Milne. Over to you, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Jess. Really appreciate it. Really happy to be here this afternoon to talk about what I think is a really fascinating and brilliant topic specifically for 2021. I feel like I've been beating the drum of deep tech for quite a long time now, and having to, in some sense, sort of convince people why it's so interesting to focus on deep tech and talk about deep tech and talk about it in a different way from other forms of tech, shall we say, digital tech or consumer tech, if you will. But I think what's been really fascinating to see over the last year, obviously putting aside all the horrific things that have happened over the last year, is a sort of what I see as shift in the way that we talk about, think about, and explore deep tech and why it's so important. So I'm going to bring out two brilliant panelists for this discussion. We've got Ian Hogarth, who's an angel investor, and Kate Kallot, who's head of emerging ideas at Nvidia. Ian, Kate, thank you so much for coming and joining me today. So as I was saying, I think one of the things that's been really interesting to see over the last year is this perhaps a bit of a shift in terms of how we talk about why we should pay attention to deep tech. I feel specifically, concepts such as supply chain and systems and interconnectivity of science and tech still felt like a bit of a weird thing to be talking about at conferences. And now it's like, oh yeah, the world's connected. Lots of one thing happens and bad stuff happens the other side of the world, and so on and so forth. And that really is, I think, the beauty and the interest of what's at the crux of deep tech. Ian, I'd love for you to maybe start. Tell us a little bit about yourself first, and then I'd love to hear a bit of your perspective on what's been, I guess, the COVID impact on the deep tech world.
So my background is originally in software. So I started out writing software when I was 18, went to university, studied engineering, and specialized in machine learning back in 2005, when I guess that might have been classed as deep tech because it was kind of not really ready for prime time. And I built a consumer internet company, Songkick, but there was always quite a lot of, machine learning related things under the hood because we were doing a bunch of information retrieval. And so after we exited Songkick, I kind of went back to my roots in machine learning a bit and started spending time with some of the key people in the field. Started investing in startups that were commercializing some of the breakthroughs that had kind of happened in machine learning research. And kind of got drawn into being, amongst other things, a deep tech investor. And I'm a generalist investor, so I do invest in sort of non-deep tech startups as well, companies like Hopin, which we're using now. But within deep tech, I think that what's been exciting about this last year is the way in which we've seen these kind of tentpole examples of the importance of investing in sort of complex science-enabled businesses. So, mRNA, the sort of vaccine drive, all the sort of work on therapeutics, even a company like Zoe, which I guess is not exactly deep tech, but has been at the forefront of diagnosing symptoms for COVID ahead of the sort of the traditional media. So I think that we've kind of we've gone through a series of step changes in deep tech over the last couple of years, but probably the biggest one is just these shining examples of the importance of accelerating science.
Amazing. Yeah, I definitely couldn't agree more with that point around just the sheer obviousness of why it's important to be looking at these technologies and deep science, as you say. Kate, same question to you. I'd love a little bit of background on yourself and a little bit of your perspective of what the last year's looked like with respect to deep tech.
Sure. So on my end, I kind of got into AI during the boom of AI in the 2014, 2015 time frame. Before that, I was working mostly around IoT and developers, mostly focused on hardware platforms and really how to bring IoT and embedded systems in the hands of developers. So I kind of followed that trend and really worked in companies and in roles which allowed me to kind of help democratize AI. And that's exactly what we're trying to do right now at Nvidia. So in my current role, I'm focusing more around emerging markets, so technology and applications coming from regions of the world that sometimes we're not talking about, such as Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, or Middle East. But then at the same time, I'm looking at all the new up and coming applied AI use cases, which is the very fun part of the role. If I look at the way COVID has impacted the technology world, from an Nvidia standpoint, we really started to see our GPUs and applications being used in ways they weren't before. COVID-19 kind of shook the world and unleashed the entire community, whether it was technology companies, whether it was pharmaceutical company, whether it was science, to contribute and help kind of detect, mitigate, monitor, and prevent the virus. We've seen applications such as Darwin AI, who has been building AI models which kind of help detect COVID-19 in chest and CT images. We've seen drug discovery rapid drug discovery advances around COVID-19. And really the beauty of everything is the advance in genomics, in microscopy, in virtual screening, using natural language processing, and using also clinical imaging. And the beauty of it has been to see all these industry partners partnering with research and also giving them the tools to kind of like advance and combat the pandemic. So the entire ecosystem has been put to work for the greater good, and we've seen new ways to apply AI, and those ways have emerged during the pandemic.
Do you feel, and this is a question for both of you, do you feel that there have been some, I guess, shifts in the way that deep tech is done that has been positive, that's perhaps been reactionary to the state of the world, that we maybe hope stays a change? So an example, for instance, might be acceleration of spinning things out, or a collaboration of working on research and getting preprints out and trying to take action, alongside obviously trying to manage the difficulties with that, clinical trial speed, things like this, that, if we were having a conversation about deep tech 2 years ago, we'd be saying this is one of the big barriers to trying to, wrestle with the world of deep tech. Kate, you're nodding, bring you in here.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was touching on before. I think we've seen the industry putting the tools available for science and for research to accelerate everything related to healthcare. If there's one thing this pandemic has brought us, is really seeing that entire technology ecosystem, that entire deep tech ecosystem working together and really fighting against one thing, which was the pandemic. So the collaboration that happened with COVID-19 wasn't existing before. If we had that conversation 2 years ago, would have been very different. Now all the tools are really available, and all those researchers work with those big tech companies, with deep tech companies. We see startup popping in and also working together within the technology ecosystem to really help combat the virus. So this has been one of beauty in what has been the pandemic over the past 2 years.
Ian, I'd love to bring you in here as well. Has this been a sort of similar thing you've seen from your seat? Do you think that there are changes that we hope stay, or is it some that are maybe a bit too risky, that have just been good for this problem, but perhaps not for other big problems that face us?
So I think there's a bunch of stuff that's just kind of crystallized this last year. So I think that, it's a bit hard to say what deep tech is, but I guess my definition of it would be something like the kind of company where you need a load of PhDs in science to make the company work. And if you don't have that, then it probably isn't a deep tech company. And I think the first kind of, deep tech companies have always kind of existed, right? Like Fairchild Semiconductor or Bell Labs, arguably with very, very deep tech companies. But I think that in the US and in Europe, we had a couple of sort of really, era-defining companies in the companies that Elon Musk built with SpaceX and Tesla, and DeepMind in Europe with Demis Hassabis and Shane and Mustafa. And I think what they both did is, Tesla and SpaceX showed what a brilliant engineer could do if they applied themselves to sort of non-software problems with a software mindset, but still tackling these other, kind of heavy engineering challenges. And with DeepMind, you had a brilliant scientist kind of putting a wrapper around a sort of science research lab. And those projects were set in motion, well over a decade ago now. And so I think what's happened is people have sort of started to see that, copy that. And in the last few years, you've just seen this acceleration in kind of exit events or sort of tentpole events where people take note. So Recursion's Pharmaceuticals going public, or Zymergen, doing a massive funding round, or, the growth of Tesla in the public markets, or the rise of OpenAI and GPT-3. And these kind of events, I think they stimulate the sort of next generation of kind of engineers who want to work on non-software problems, or brilliant scientists who want to start companies to kind of go into the arena. And as a result of that, we're now starting to see a flurry of incredible companies coming through. So that got started a lot earlier, but I think the rush through this IPO window of the last 2 years has probably catalyzed a lot of additional momentum. I think outside of that, I think probably the other couple of things are, the prioritization of progress in biology that the pandemic has represented, and the sort of the seriousness with which we're taking that, and then a whole host of other kind of frontier technologies kind of getting ready for prime time. So I think that crypto has had an incredible sort of rush over the last the last couple of last year, say, and that really is kind of a lot of the frontiers of computer science. Climate tech has started to really accelerate. You've obviously got all the investment that machine learning sort of starting to bear fruit. Quantum computing, advanced manufacturing. There's a lot of stuff I think got catalyzed 5 to 10 years ago that is now starting to really accelerate.
Before I ask my next question, I should have said at the beginning, for everyone who's watching, please feel free to ask questions, or please ask questions. We'd love to hear your questions. I'll obviously keep chatting to Kate and Ian for a bit, but if there's any questions, they'll be popped up right now, and I can either weave them in, or we can leave them to the end and do Q&A session for the last sort of 10 minutes. But please do ask them as they come, so that I know what you're all thinking. I would love to weave in some of those thoughts. So building a little bit on, so you mentioned kind of, I think you said the word bandwagon at one point, or at least that's what I was thinking in my head when you were talking there, Ian. And I think one of the themes of discussion around deep tech that, again, is something that's been, if we'd been speaking about 2 years' time, we would have been talking about how you manage the sort of hype around deep tech and investors kind of wanting to come in and be part and get a slice of this, but not necessarily having the expertise or understanding or indeed the patience for deep tech. And obviously this last year, you've highlighted a few different areas where there's been these very mainstream, shall we say, coverage of these huge growths, as well as Kate, you've also been saying, this very obvious need for a lot of these different kinds of complex science and technologies really at the forefront. So how do you kind of perceive it in terms of, from an investor standpoint, Ian, the bandwagoning or hype effect that perhaps might be going on right now in deep tech? Is that something to be excited about? Is that something to worry about? What are your thoughts?
I think that the thing that's different about deep tech to sort of conventional software startups is we still don't really have like normalization of metrics. So, take a company like, like a company like Hopin or SoRare, or one of these breakout software companies of the last year, post seed, at some point there's a kind of set of metrics people are looking out for, recurring revenue, for example, or monthly active users that have become established, and you can kind of at a certain point map the company into a spreadsheet. And as a result of being able to map it into a spreadsheet, a wider pool of investors can understand the business and invest in it, and the cost of capital goes down for the startup. And with deep tech, what you often find is startups just look a lot messier through seed, Series A, Series B, because the sort of thing they're working on. I mean, I should give you a good example. I talked to a startup earlier today and agreed to invest in them, working on kind of green chemistry and some very, very kind of very sophisticated use of enzymes in production of chemicals. And that company is going to fundamentally have extreme discontinuities in the metrics you can use to evaluate it. And it's basically going to look like a bunch of academic papers, a bunch of published research, a bunch of sort of biomarkers that they've developed, maybe some sort of, some examples of the chemistry starting to work. And the investors watching that through the first, let's say, $20-30 million worth of funding are not going to have something that maps to a spreadsheet. They have to fundamentally be willing to engage with the underlying fundamentals of what the science is it working, and how to think about it. And so the pool of capital that wants to do that and understands how to do that is much smaller than the pool of capital that's investing in, say, SaaS startups, where you basically look at MRR and ARR and how fast they're growing. So I think that just creates a more challenging funding environment for those kind of companies. There are fewer investors that will back them. There are fewer smart and good investors that will back them, and so the companies are often a little bit starved of capital in the early stages. And then at some point they cross this Rubicon where it's working, and the discontinuities have produced this sudden step change in revenue, step change in visibility, and everything starts to compound very rapidly. So look at a company like Northvolt and the acceleration they've seen in the last couple of years, or Tesla, SpaceX, the sort of from the generation previously. So I think it makes the challenge for deep tech founders, who are often scientists, one of sort of narrative development. They have to get really good at communicating something that doesn't easily map to a sort of normalizable spreadsheet that investors have in their heads. And they have to be a lot more selective in the investors they approach. But from my perspective, it's incredibly fun because you get to go, really deep into the weeds with brilliant founders and scientists and figure out what is really going in the company.
I'd love to bring you in here, Kate, because obviously your job title is head of emerging areas, right? So it's your job to sift through that hype, shall we say, but also what you were saying about not just looking at, I guess, the trends and the sort of usual Western world, but also trying to seek out what these emerging ideas are elsewhere. So how have you seen that shift in, I guess, attention and bandwagoning, if you will, over the last year? Do you feel that there's still a lot of untapped things that just aren't being spoke about, or has it really got a lot more momentum?
I guess one of the things that the pandemic reminded us is that when you look at tools such as technologies such as AI, they're here to help contribute to a bigger purpose. Over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of companies using technology to try solve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So these are the 2030 goals that we need to solve to make the world a better place. So if you look at areas or at markets such as Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, or Middle East, really emerging markets, we've seen technologies being applied, and also a new type of deep tech startup emerging from there. I'm thinking about InstaDeep, for example, which is one of the only deep tech startup which is from the African continent. They've been doing a lot of research with Oxford University. They've been working with a lot of big semiconductor company, including Nvidia. But they've also managed to put their expertise and their research to work to advance conversational AI for underrepresented languages, for example. They've been really trying to accelerate research across the African continent. So we've seen an emergence of startups, of AI deep tech startups that are coming from different backgrounds, coming from different markets, but also applying technology in a different way than the Western world, because the nature of the challenges that they're trying to solve are pretty much different than the challenges we could think of in the US, in Canada, in Europe, or in Asia, for example. So one of the interesting trends that I've been diving into recently has been around the startups coming from this emergence, because if you look at the way the innovation is driven specifically in Africa, for example, it's kind of a bottom-up innovation. It's an innovation which is coming from grassroots communities, startups, and they are helping in terms the private sector and then the public sector catch up with everything that's happening in AI or in deep tech. So having these startups and making sure that we surface their innovation, give them a platform on which they can talk and advance research in their area has been something that we've been working on over the past couple of years. So if you look at some of the interesting, or some of the crossroad where you around emerging technologies or emerging applied AI or deep tech use cases, and then emerging markets, you will see things such as climate, or any data which is related to Earth observation, using AI machine learning to apply to some of the research in that space, for example. And these are challenges that are being solved on the African continent or in emerging markets, but then could be applied or reverse engineered in the West or in the East. So this is an interesting trend that I've been looking into. If you look at companies like Zipline, for example, in Ghana, they've been using drones in the context of COVID to take samples to testing sites. And the US has reverse engineered this use case for similar tasks after the pilot programs were conducted in Africa. I would say more over the next couple of years, we'll see more of this applied innovation coming from emerging markets and being reverse engineered in more established and developed markets.
Amazing. That's a really oh, sorry, Ian, on you go. Do you want to come in?
No, I was going to say I really agree with Kate, and I think I was thinking about a startup called Modularity Grid, and it's a really nice example of exactly what Kate's saying, because it's a fabulous founder called Elizabeth Nyoko, and she has been working on essentially mini grids, machine learning enabled mini grids, working with off-grid solar and biomass power sources to power for example, like a local clinic or something like that, through a critical sort of fluctuation in energy availability. And the same technology is actually equally applicable to sort of off-grid solar in the US, right? And so I think I totally agree with that point, that will be that sort of bottom-up deep tech can emerge in very interesting ways in the African continent. To your point about bandwagoning, I think a good model to use for thinking about this stuff is the one that was developed by Kallot Perez. So one of my sort of side gigs is working at UCL as a visiting professor, and Kallot Perez works in the same institute that Mariana Mazzucato runs, and she has this incredible book called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital. And the core thesis is essentially that the way that financial capital relates to technological innovation is through a sort of series of defined phases. And one of those phases is basically the speculative bubble. And what happens during the speculative bubble is investors think they're going to get really rich in a new and interesting area of technology. Tons of money floods in. A lot of stuff gets built, some of it which ends up being completely valueless, but some of which ends up being the fundamental infrastructure that enables a golden age of that technology after a crash has happened. So the classic example at the moment probably be crypto, in terms of a sort of a speculative bubble that's building out a lot of infrastructure that then may end up being useful. But the same has happened in clean tech, around the turn of the millennium. And I think that, so whenever I see some level of speculation occurring, I kind of see it as a good thing, because it's building out the infrastructure building out a bunch of stuff that will yield prosperity in years to come. And I actually don't think we've really had that yet with deep tech. I feel like when I look across, the portfolio of my deep tech investments, I still think it's all quite measured. I'm not seeing like, crazy sort of SoftBank style rounds across deep tech in the same way there is around SaaS and consumer. So I think we've still got a ways to run in terms of the cycle that Kallot outlines. And I actually think a bit more sort of speculative capital chasing these kind of deep tech moonshots wouldn't be a bad thing.
Yeah, I think, having written a book about hype, I suppose I see that there's definitely a positive to hype in some ways, but I think it's not just about the investment, right? There's cultural trends, there's baking in of ideas around what tech and science is being used for. And I think that's where I tend to worry a little bit when it comes to that bandwagoning effect and what is the promise that's being made about certain kinds of deep tech. I think particularly if you look at areas like quantum, there's a level of like self-fulfilling prophecy that the hype has had over the years, which is a good thing in terms of basic science. But you only have to look at D-Wave to see where hype has been really problematic and has resulted in issues. Although you could also argue that D-Wave has now actually kind of made something useful based on the fact that they got the money, but is that fair? All these sorts of questions is kind of what I tend to worry about with that bandwagoning effect. Let's move on to another topic. Andrew Ward's asked a question, which is brilliant because it was the next question I was going to ask anyway. So let's just ask it now. So thank you, Andrew, for that. Andrew asks, geographically, which cities, regions, or countries do you see the most promising ecosystems for high growth deep tech companies emerging? What do you see as the essential components of an ecosystem? And if I can also add a little bit to that, I don't want to keep bringing it back to COVID, but this is the reality of the world we live in. Considering the fact that, congregating in areas is not necessarily something that's quite so doable right now. However, movement has been able to be made in the last year in various different areas of deep tech. Is this sort of holy grail of building the brilliant local ecosystem even as important as it maybe was before? Kate, let's start with you.
Sure. First, I would probably go back to what is a deep tech ecosystem, or what constitutes a robust technology ecosystem. It's kind of a mix of a lot of things. It's a mix of the technology enabling those research, the scientists to build applications. It's a mix of the developers, the developer community also contributing to that, the data science, the research, the industry coming together, which is kind of more minds, more people, innovation, and solving more complex problems. Based on that, I would say geographically, there is a potential to actually build those local ecosystem across everywhere in the world. I could sound a little bit optimistic, but that's kind of what I've been looking at recently. If you look at regions like Africa, for example, we've been recently looking into how do we get those startups and those developer communities really helping building long-term capacity around AI, around data science, around technology in countries in Africa. So I've been working with countries such as Kenya, Rwanda, Ghana to really understand what their local ecosystem looks like and really educate the private and the public sector on the startup ecosystem, the developer ecosystem, and the tools that are available for them to build solutions, and also support them for them to succeed locally. So looking at this, I would say that probably the geographically it can happen anywhere, but it's going to take collaboration between a lot of different bodies, and that's probably where the challenge actually relies. And Jan will be probably able to talk about this better than I, but it's going to also take VC and investments coming into those countries and coming into those startups and into these ecosystems to actually help them develop. If I can say that if I have one hope, I would say that probably we will see more and more deep tech companies coming from emerging markets. I want to see hundreds of InstaDeep coming from Africa or coming from Latin America over the next couple of years.
Amazing. Ian, let's bring you in on this same question around what it is that makes for a good ecosystem, and where you think the most promising ones for high growth deep tech currently are?
So I think one of the really interesting things about deep tech is that typically there is like some increased level of physicality in the company. Like you have a lab, right? As an example, you have a bunch of sort of things that need pipetting. And as a result of that, like I've seen the deep tech companies pivot much less aggressively to remote work. They tend to actually get back to the office as quickly as possible. So I think you'll get stronger local ecosystems as a result. In terms of locations, I think it's two different types. It's either mature startup ecosystems. So you know, it's places like the Bay Area, London, Stockholm, where there's just a wave of sort of second or third generation founders who did something in consumer, for example, and want to do something in deep tech. So like Daniel Ek, all of the new investments he's doing are all pretty deep tech things, even though he originally built Spotify in Stockholm as a consumer company. The other is just, you know, cities with incredible scientific talent and sort of university foundations. So it's your Zurichs, Paris, Munich, Beijing, Cambridge, Oxford, Bristol, those kinds of places, London with Imperial. I think anywhere where there's just a really high number of sort of science PhDs basically is going to be an amazing place to build these companies, because if you're the founder of a sort of advanced materials company and you're thinking, where am I going to put this company? Where are the best chemists or the best physicists in the world? The best mathematicians? You might be thinking about Boston, you might be thinking about London, you might be thinking about Cambridge or Beijing. And so I think it's going to be these kind of, you know, these like top research cities are going to be the ones that are going to be the best ecosystems. And the real magic is going to happen where you've got a mature startup ecosystem like in Boston or in London meeting a bunch of top tier science universities. Those cities are gonna I think be the really the ones to watch.
Let's bring another question in from the audience, because I was thinking exactly the same from Duncan McKean just when we were talking about ecosystems, because so for context, Duncan McKean has asked, with a huge breadth of addressable tech areas, AI, cyber, life sciences, etc., are we foolish to lump everything together and discuss deep tech as a single sector, as it will, different rates in different areas? And I think that I was thinking about Bristol specifically when you were speaking there, Ian, because for anyone who doesn't know, Bristol's now got a quite thriving chemistry deep tech, I guess, hub, and I would say predominantly fueled by Harry Destruquois and the kind of the success of Xylo, and what he's also then built with this, I guess, co-working lab for chemistry startups that just didn't exist before, right? So you could argue that, you know, Bristol's going to be great for chemistry, but is it going to be good for quantum? Arguably not. So how do you both think about, you know, as much as deep tech can be described, as you said, Ian, as companies with PhDs, as it were, how do you kind of look at it as this more distributed sector, or are we foolish to be talking about it all as one? Kate, let's start with you.
Sure. I guess on one side, yes, on the other side, no, because we do lump everything under the deep tech umbrella. But then if you dive into each of these areas, you have specializations and you have PhDs for each of them, and research community or applied research to each of them. And most of them are pretty different. I mean, AI and cybersecurity or sciences are completely functionally different from an application perspective. So lumping everything into one sector could be a foolish mistake. But on the other side, I think we're all contributing, we're all doing something which is the same, using technology to kind of solve those complex challenges. And the way those ecosystems function always need the same baseline. They need research, they need kind of science and the PhD communities, and they need an ecosystem to thrive into. So as the baseline for each of these sector or segments within the deep tech umbrella, they all need the same thing to kind of advance. So I guess that's why we're kind of putting it under one umbrella. But there are some, I would agree that there are some differences that we need to be mindful of.
Ian, what are your thoughts on this quasi-controversial question?
I mean, I think so. Let's go to the Bristol example, right? Because I think it maybe makes it more real. So, you know, Bristol you know, what Harry Destrucroix has done with Science Creates is incredible. Like, it's kind of the WeWork of science, right? With the lameness of WeWork. But you've also got, you know, GraphCore, right, which is sort of advanced semiconductors. You've got you know, actually one of the best quantum computing departments in Europe, in Bristol, and you know, one of the founders of the company that I chair, Phasecraft, and half the Phasecraft team is based in Bristol. So you have a pretty thriving quantum.
Perhaps quantum was my bad example as the other. Let's go with agriculture instead then.
Yeah, but I think what I think that kind of indicates is just that I do think that scientists to some degree do stick together, right? So Austin, you know, the number of different things you can study at a really world-class university with an emphasis on science, you know, it does tend to span biology, chemistry, physics, computer science. So I think that there will be actually these nice self-reinforcing effects where, yes, you know, the kind of biologists that work at a company like Xylo won't be the same as the kind of nanotechnologists that work at a company like GraphCore, or the quantum software people that work at a company like Phasecraft. But for example, the commercial people will move across all of those kinds of companies and sort of kind of osmotically transfer information between startups. So I think there will be actually some sort of rich get richer effect to these top cities that have an incredible research base. And I think that there will be a lot of cross-pollination. I mean, you can see it in London when you walk around King's Cross, right? You've got the Crypt, you've got DeepMind, you've got Central St Martin's, you've got this kind of quite interesting wide range of kind of top tier institutions. And so I think that the pollination will happen.
I think, though, you got to admit, though, that, I mean, King's Cross has the Knowledge Quarter as an organization, right? They have a very intentional ecosystem building team that has gone, we're going to make the most of this. And I think maybe perhaps there's that element too, that, as Kate put it, you still need to have this level of assessment of the ecosystem and making sure that it's encouraged, shall we say, as opposed to just organic.
Totally.
We've only got 5 minutes left, and I want to get to one more audience question and then perhaps a cheeky little future question at the end. So the first one from Aman Anguish, I'm so sorry if I've mispronounced your name. In the absence of well-defined benchmarks, Ian, you mentioned them earlier, for deep tech, how do you evaluate the technology? So a couple of top tips perhaps from you both. Ian, let's start with you.
I think what I love about deep tech investing is that it's kind of like about finding something weird and special. It's kind of, when you first, I didn't, meet Demis Hassabis when he was first kind of setting up DeepMind, but, he was basically like, I've gone and spent a bunch of time at the intersection of neuroscience and computer science. I've also got a gaming background. I think we can use games plus this very specific, quite niche area of machine learning called deep reinforcement learning to advance the state of the art of AI. I'm not going to make any revenue. I've got this weird idea about using it for fashion image recommendations. And can you give me $10 million? Right. And so, the investors that made that decision, which actually none of them were in the UK. It was like, Li Ka-shing or Selena Chow in Hong Kong, and people like Peter Thiel in San Francisco. You're kind of taking a bet on a really weird science fiction-y vision of the future. So I think it's somebody with a very sci-fi, future vision combined with the scientific and technical credibility to pull it off, and the kind of drive that is going to be needed to push through the obstacles and the lack of interest in funding this kind of technology, because there are going to be far fewer investors for some, futuristic battery technology than there are going to be for the next kind of buzzy SaaS app.
Yeah. Kate, I'm going to come to you for some of your top tips as well. How do you look at this, considering your role?
Sure. So I don't actually benchmark all these technologies. We enable them to build the applications that they're building, right? But if I can say one thing, is going to be, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Ultimately, technology is used to be applied to solve a challenge. So what is this challenge? How is your solution mapping to this challenge? And how useful is your solution going to be not just in the context of your environment, but also is it scalable across the world or in different contexts and markets and so on. So that would be kind of how I look at it. But then again, I'm not the one who invests. That's probably more on the Jan side.
No problem. Okay, we've only got 1 minute left, but I'm going to squeeze in one final question because I want to end on a future-facing note. I'd love for you to very quickly share one or two either startups or areas that you're particularly excited about. Ian, you're not allowed to pick one that you invested in, and would love to hear, just for the audience's sake, what you're excited about when it comes to what's coming next in deep tech. Ian, we'll start with you.
I mean, I think novel chemistry-based techniques for carbon capture and storage just going to be something absolutely massive that comes in that area. And I would say futuristic materials that enable engineers to make things they've never made before. We had a big breakthrough this year in room temperature superconductivity. Something like that would be that worked in ambient conditions, would transform a whole range of industries.
Amazing. And Kate, what are you excited about?
I would tend to agree on futuristic materials and getting the engineers to push the limits of what they've done before. But then again, if I go back to the nature of my job and what I was saying before, selfishly, I would say anything that's coming from emerging markets we haven't seen yet or we don't even know about yet. So this innovation coming from regions like Africa, for example.
Keeping your eye on elsewhere, shall we say. Amazing.
Exactly.
Ian, Kate, thank you so much. Can you believe we've been talking for 40 minutes? It feels like only 5. Thank you so much for joining me in this discussion, giving and sharing so much of your expertise. There's so much to say about deep tech, and I'm excited that it's still something that people want to talk about even after all these years. It never really gets old, I think. So thank you so much for coming and joining us, and thank you, CogX, for hosting us today. I'll pass it back to Jess.
Thanks, Gemma.
That was absolutely incredible. Thanks so much to Gemma, Ian, and Kate for such a fascinating, honest, and fast-paced conversation. As a physicist who works at Imperial, who's got a seed fund to start a project on futuristic materials with MIT, I was super grateful that Ian included us both in his best locations in the world. So to everyone in the audience, go and get a cup of tea and stretch your legs and come back to the cutting edge stage in 20 minutes for a power hour of probabilistic programming. Thanks so much and see you soon.